A racist white nurse purposely abandons a disabled black woman in her wheelchair overnight. She is shocked to discover that the black woman has overheard all the racist comments about the black patients in the hospital. Aaliyah's eyes scanned the dull, muted corners of the room as she settled into the stiff hospital bed. Her body ached, her muscles tight from the surgery's after-effects, yet every movement seemed to amplify her discomfort. She hesitated before pressing the call button, unsure if she wanted to deal with the curt responses she'd been receiving since her arrival. But the pain in her shoulders was getting sharper, and the stiff pillow wasn't helping. Each passing second stretched longer than the last. Aaliyah tried to steady her breathing, focusing on the steady hum of the fluorescent light overhead, the sterile environment, the white walls, the unfeeling silence. It all left her feeling helpless. Finally, the door creaked open and Bethany entered. Her smile was tight, barely reaching her eyes as she glanced at Aaliyah, then immediately shifted her gaze to the equipment, as if the monitors and tubes were far more deserving of her attention. "What is it now?" Bethany's voice was flat, with a hint of impatience breaking through her professional tone. Aaliyah swallowed, unsure if she'd made a mistake by calling for help. I just need my pillow adjusted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard to breathe comfortably," Bethany sighed, crossing her arms as she looked down at Aaliyah. "Again?" Her voice carried an edge of annoyance. "You've already asked me 3 times tonight. I have other patients to attend to, you know." Heat crept up Aaliyah's cheeks, a mix of pain and embarrassment. If it's no trouble, I'm in a lot of pain." Bethany rolled her eyes, shifting her stance as though she was calculating whether to walk out or comply. Finally, she moved to Aaliyah's bed, jerking the pillow out from behind her head and shoving it back under her with a briskness that made Aaliyah wince. "There," Bethany muttered, "but you'll have to start managing on your own. There are other patients who need help just as much." Aaliyah bit her lip, stifling the urge to speak up about the discomfort. The way Bethany had positioned her made her shoulders ache even more, but she knew better than to push. The unspoken line had been drawn. The fewer requests she made, the better. Bethany's demeanor left no room for doubt. Just as Bethany turned to leave, the door swung open, and Dr. Aaron Mitchell entered. His footsteps were soft yet purposeful, and his faint, warm smile seemed to break through the tension in the room. "Good evening, Ms. Johnson," he greeted warmly, his eyes kind as he looked at Aaliyah. "Just here to check in on you." Bethany's posture stiffened, but her tone remained professional. "I was just helping her settle in, Doctor." Dr. Mitchell nodded, casting a brief, appreciative glance her way. "Glad to hear it." He moved closer to Aaliyah's bedside, his voice lowering slightly as he spoke to her with genuine concern. "How's the pain? Have you been able to rest at all?" Aaliyah mustered a small smile, feeling a flicker of relief from his gentleness. "I'm managing," she replied quietly, though her gaze darted to Bethany, who stood rigidly, her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Good. Dr. Mitchell nodded. "Rest is essential. I'll make sure the staff checks in periodically." He turned back to Bethany with a brief, expectant nod. "Keep an eye on her, please." "Of course, Doctor," Bethany replied, her voice dripping with tight courtesy. But as soon as he turned to leave, the mask dropped. Her expression hardened, and the room seemed to grow colder, the warmth Dr. Mitchell had brought vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. Bethany leaned over Aaliyah, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You might want to remember who's here all night," she murmured, her words laced with an unsettling edge. "Doctors come and go. I'm the one making sure you're comfortable." Aaliyah swallowed, feeling her words stick in her throat. There was no mistaking the underlying threat in Bethany's voice, the unspoken message that her care depended entirely on her compliance. She held Bethany's gaze for a moment, then dropped her eyes, feeling trapped in her own bed, as if the walls were closing in around her. Without another word, Bethany turned and left, the door swinging shut with a quiet, hollow click. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the hospital machinery. Aaliyah lay back, staring at the ceiling, the unease settling deeper, prickling at her senses. And so, she lay there, vulnerable and alone, each second stretching longer than the last. Aaliyah's discomfort grew as the hours dragged on, her body aching in every possible way. She tried to ignore the pressure in her bladder, hoping it would pass, but the feeling only intensified, adding to her misery. She shifted awkwardly, wincing from the sharp jolt of pain in her side. There was no choice but to press the call button again. It took longer this time. The seconds stretched into minutes, and Aaliyah began to wonder if Bethany was purposely ignoring her. Finally, the door opened and Bethany stepped in, her expression a mixture of impatience and barely concealed irritation. "What now?" Bethany asked. Her voice clipped as she crossed her arms and glanced at Aaliyah with a faint sneer. Aaliyah swallowed, feeling her cheeks heat up. I need to go to the bathroom, she said quietly, trying not to sound like she was pleading. Can you help me into the wheelchair? Bethany let out an exaggerated sigh, but after a moment, she pushed the wheelchair toward the bed, its wheels squeaking as it stopped next to her. Fine. Let's make this quick. I don't have time to keep coming back here every 5 minutes. Aaliyah bit her tongue, forcing herself not to respond to Bethany's remark. With Bethany's brisk assistance, she carefully maneuvered herself from the bed into the wheelchair, her body aching with each movement. Bethany's hands were cold and impersonal as she gripped Aaliyah's arm, her touch devoid of the gentleness or care Aaliyah had hoped for. Once she was settled in the wheelchair, Bethany rolled her out of the room, her pace fast and unsteady, making Aaliyah grip the chair's arms tightly to keep herself stable. They passed through the empty, dimly lit corridors, the shadows pooling in the corners, making the hospital feel eerie and desolate. But instead of taking her directly to the bathroom, Bethany stopped abruptly in an unfamiliar hallway. Aaliyah glanced around, her heart sinking as she realized there was no one else around. Wait here, Bethany said flatly, her tone more an order than a request. Aaliyah's brow furrowed. But aren't you taking me to the bathroom? Bethany gave her a cool, dismissive look. I have other things to do. I'll be back when I can. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Aaliyah alone in the darkened hallway, her footsteps echoing until they faded completely. Aaliyah sat in stunned silence, watching Bethany disappear down the corridor. The shadows seemed to grow thicker around her, pressing in from all sides. She shifted uncomfortably, the need to relieve herself gnawing at her, but there was nothing she could do. The quiet of the hallway was unsettling, interrupted only by the occasional sound of distant voices or the faint hum of machinery from somewhere deeper in the hospital. Aaliyah tried to steady her breathing, her hands clenching the wheelchair's armrests. She called out softly, hoping someone might hear her, but her weakened voice was swallowed by the thick silence. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. Her body ached from sitting so long, her shoulders tense, her legs growing numb. She bit her lip, glancing around for any sign of Bethany or anyone who could help her. But the hallway remained empty, the shadows unyielding. As she sat in the wheelchair, Aaliyah's unease deepened. She felt small and abandoned, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Aaliyah's grip on the armrests tightened as she strained to hear any sign of someone approaching. The quietness of the dark hallway felt oppressive, swallowing her faint breaths and magnifying her sense of isolation. The minutes dragged on, and the dull ache in her bladder grew more intense, mixing with the stiffness in her muscles. She shifted uncomfortably, but every movement only brought a fresh wave of pain. A faint sound reached her ears. Voices, muffled but getting closer. Her heart leapt, relief washing over her as she hoped someone might finally help her. The voices grew louder, and 2 figures appeared at the far end of the hallway, walking slowly, engaged in conversation. They wore scrubs, but Aaliyah couldn't make out their faces in the dim light. She hesitated, wondering if she should call out. But before she could decide, snippets of their conversation drifted toward her, stopping her cold. Another complaint from that woman in room 6, one of them said, her voice tinged with exasperation. You know, some patients just think they're entitled to special treatment. Right? The other replied, his tone dismissive. It's always the same types. They come in, start making demands, then act like we owe them something. The two chuckled softly, and Aaliyah's stomach twisted as she listened, their words cutting deeper than she expected. A familiar creeping feeling of humiliation settled over her, one she'd felt before when her needs were dismissed as nuisances. Just yesterday, another one was complaining about her meds. Can you believe it? The woman continued. These people really don't understand what it's like for us. We're overworked, understaffed, and they're just making our lives harder. Aaliyah held her breath, feeling her face grow hot. These people. The way the woman said it felt like a slap, an unspoken judgment that weighed heavily in the dim corridor. She bit her lip, her body tense with a mixture of anger and helplessness. The voices faded as the two continued down the hall, their laughter echoing faintly behind them. Aaliyah sat still, the weight of their words pressing down on her. She looked down at her hands, feeling a surge of frustration building in her chest. They had no idea what it felt like to be in her position, alone, in pain, forced to depend on people who saw her as nothing more than a burden. Just as she began to steel herself, determined not to let their words affect her, Another voice floated from the hallway behind her. This time, it was low and quiet, almost conspiratorial. "I heard they almost lost that patient in 204 yesterday," the voice said, sounding vaguely amused. "She was asking for hours, and no one even noticed." A second voice, deeper and tinged with sarcasm, responded, "Oh, please. If they don't like the service, they can go somewhere else. Not like anyone's forcing them to be here." Aaliyah felt a shiver run through her. The implications were horrifying, the indifference, the callousness. The fact that her needs and the needs of others like her were treated as inconveniences to be brushed aside. She was beginning to understand that her experience wasn't isolated. It was part of something bigger, something dark and deeply ingrained within the hospital's walls. The voices faded, leaving her alone once more. Her mind raced, replaying the words she'd overheard, each one feeling like a bruise she couldn't see but could feel deeply. She thought of Bethany's cold demeanor, the lack of care, the passive hostility. It wasn't just neglect, it was systematic, a disregard that went beyond her as an individual. Aaliyah's eyes focused on a distant corner of the hallway, her breath shallow but steady. She didn't want to believe what she was coming to realize, but the evidence was in the words she'd overheard, in the hollow clicks of Bethany's footsteps, in the dismissive laughs that echoed down the hall. Her fingers unclenched slowly, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She would remember every word, every detail, every dismissive comment. She would not be silenced or forgotten. The hallway fell silent again, save for the soft hum of machinery down the corridor. Aaliyah shifted uncomfortably, feeling the sharp pain in her bladder remind her of her growing need to use the bathroom. She tried to stifle it, willing herself to hold on as she waited, hoping someone, anyone, might notice her. But her hopes were dashed as two more staff members rounded the corner, their voices filling the otherwise quiet corridor. She didn't recognize them, but the familiarity in their voices and the casual tone suggested they were regulars on this shift, comfortable enough to speak freely without concern for being overheard. "Did you see the patient in 112? One of them said, a young man with an easygoing tone that turned harsh as he continued. Another one of them causing trouble. "Oh, I know the type," his companion, a woman with a husky voice, replied with a sneer. "They always come in with that attitude. It's like they expect us to drop everything for them, just because they're here." Aaliyah's stomach twisted, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her body tensing with each word. "And it's not just entitlement," the young man added, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "You notice how they always act like they're owed something? Always wanting extra help, extra attention, right?" The woman chuckled, a cruel edge in her laugh. "Just wait till they start complaining about racism, too. That's the favorite card, isn't it? Anytime we don't cater to them like they're special, suddenly we're the bad guys." The words stung, each one hitting Aaliyah like a blow. Her jaw clenched and she bit her lip, trying to hold back a surge of emotion. Every insult, every assumption they made about people like her, all because of the color of her skin, felt personal, a reminder of the prejudices she'd encountered so many times in her life. Here, where she was at her most vulnerable, she was nothing more than a stereotype to them. The young man scoffed. "Can you blame them? Most of them don't even have insurance half the time. They're lucky to be here at all." Aaliyah's breath caught. Her mind raced, each word weighing her down, deepening her feelings of anger and helplessness. She'd come here to heal, to get the care she needed. Yet these people, the ones entrusted with her well-being, saw her as nothing but a burden, someone less deserving. "I swear if I have to hear one more sob story about how hard life is," the woman continued, her voice dripping with disdain, "I might just walk out. It's always the same excuses. Maybe if they took care of themselves they wouldn't be in here so often," the man muttered. "But you know, that's not our problem." The two laughed, their voices fading as they continued down the hall, leaving Aaliyah alone in the shadows, her mind swirling with a mixture of shame, anger, and resolve. Each word she'd overheard felt like it had etched itself into her memory, and as she sat there, feeling abandoned, a new determination took root. She was done feeling powerless, done being silent in the face of such contempt. Morning light filtered faintly into the hallway, casting long shadows that stretched over Aaliyah, who sat slumped in the wheelchair. Her back ached, and her entire body felt stiff and sore from the hours she'd spent waiting, alone in the cold corridor. Every whispered insult and mocking laugh replayed in her mind, strengthening her resolve to confront this injustice, somehow. Just as she began to consider pressing the call button again, The familiar sound of heels clicked down the hall. Nurse Bethany Hensley appeared, her expression carefully neutral as she approached. Her eyes skimmed over Aaliyah with a hint of disinterest before she plastered on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson," Bethany greeted, her voice a little too cheerful. "Hope you managed to get some rest." Aaliyah bit back a sharp reply, instead offering a slight nod. Her voice was too weak to carry far, and her body too tired to argue with Bethany's feigned politeness. "I'd like to go back to my room now," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Bethany's smile tightened. "Oh, we'll get you settled soon enough," she said, moving behind the wheelchair. "It's a shame, though, when patients make things difficult for themselves and others." She gave a faint sigh as she gripped the wheelchair's handles, her tone an odd mix of courtesy and warning. Aaliyah felt a chill run down her spine. I just needed help last night," she replied softly, looking straight ahead. Bethany pushed the wheelchair down the empty hall, the wheels squeaking in the silence. Her voice was low but clear as she spoke. "I'm sure you know how it is, Ms. Johnson. We're all doing our best here. But some patients, they forget they're not the only ones in need." Aaliyah's fingers clenched tightly around the armrests, her heart pounding. "I understand," she replied, her voice trembling but steady. "But everyone deserves respect." Bethany's expression hardened as they rounded the corner. She paused, then leaned close to Aaliyah, her face inches away. Her voice dropped to a whisper, a faint sneer at the edges. "Respect is earned, Ms. Johnson, and sometimes it's wise to mind your own business." The threat hung heavy in the air, each word carrying a chilling finality. Aaliyah felt her breath hitch, and her mind raced with flashes of the previous night. The cruel remarks, the laughter, the whispered bigotry she'd been forced to endure. She realized that Bethany knew, and that this was a warning. Bethany straightened and resumed pushing the wheelchair, moving faster now. "We wouldn't want anyone spreading stories," she added softly, as if discussing the weather. "After all, we're the ones looking after you." They reached her room, and Bethany maneuvered the wheelchair up to the bed with a briskness that bordered on impatience. "Here you are," she said, releasing her hold on the handles and stepping back, her gaze fixed on Aaliyah. Aaliyah took a deep breath, gathering her resolve. She met Bethany's gaze, her face resolute. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she replied quietly. "But what I heard, it's wrong, and I think you know that." Bethany's eyes narrowed, her polite smile disappearing. She leaned in close enough that Aaliyah could feel her breath. "Be careful, Ms. Johnson," she murmured. "This isn't the place for misunderstandings." Without another word, she straightened, gave a tight smile, and left the room, leaving Aaliyah alone. This time, however, the silence felt different. It was not the lonely, hollow silence of the night before, but the silence that followed a challenge, a line drawn between them. Aaliyah took a deep breath, her resolve growing stronger. Whatever came next, she was ready to stand her ground. Hours passed, but Aaliyah couldn't shake the icy feeling left behind by Bethany's words. The threat lingered, echoing in her mind. She felt trapped, not only by her physical condition, but by the unspoken pressure to keep silent about what she'd overheard. Yet as much as the memory of Bethany's cold, hostile tone unnerved her, it also stoked a quiet fire inside her. Aaliyah's phone sat on the small tray beside her bed, a lifeline to the outside world. She hesitated, her fingers brushing against it, uncertain of her next step. She thought back on everything she'd overheard, the callous comments, the casual remarks about patients like her. The dehumanizing attitude that pervaded the hospital staff's words wasn't just carelessness. It was a culture, a pattern. The door opened, and a young nurse, Janice, entered. Aaliyah had seen her briefly on an earlier shift, a quiet, soft-spoken trainee who always moved quickly and rarely lingered to chat. But today, as she adjusted Aaliyah's IV, Janice's gaze lingered a bit longer, her brow furrowed with concern. "How are you doing, Ms. Johnson?" Janice asked gently, her voice free of the cold detachment Aaliyah had grown used to. Aaliyah hesitated, unsure how much she could say, but there was something about Janice's open expression that made her feel a flicker of trust. "I've had a difficult night," Aaliyah admitted quietly, watching Janice's reaction. The nurse's face softened, and she looked around cautiously before leaning in slightly. "I heard that Nurse Hensley was overseeing your care last night." Her tone suggested she was aware of Bethany's reputation. Aaliyah nodded, feeling a surge of validation. "Yes, and I overheard some things. Things that make me feel like this isn't just about me. It's how they see all of us. Janice glanced at the door, her expression conflicted. I wish I could say it's not true, but she shook her head, her voice dropping lower. This place has issues. A lot of people don't see patients the way they should. Especially, she trailed off, but Aaliyah understood. Taking a deep breath, Aaliyah felt the final pieces fall into place. People need to know, she said, her voice steadying. They need to know what happens when no one's looking, how some patients are made to feel less human. Janice straightened, her eyes filled with a mixture of empathy and fear. Ms. Johnson, I know you're right, but this place, if you go public, they'll do everything they can to protect themselves. I'm not scared of them, Aaliyah replied firmly, though her heart pounded. I've been through worse, and if I don't say something, this will just keep happening, to others who may not be able to speak for themselves. Janice nodded slowly, giving her a faint, supportive smile. I understand. Just, please be careful. With that, Janice finished her adjustments and left, her parting glance one of quiet encouragement. Aaliyah reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen before she finally unlocked it. She scrolled through her contacts, finding the number of an old friend, someone she knew would understand and help. When she tapped to call, her voice was shaky at first, but she grew stronger as she spoke. She told her friend about her experience, about the things she'd overheard, the threats, the dismissive attitudes, and the overt racism that tainted her entire stay. Each word felt like a release, as if she were reclaiming the dignity that had been chipped away over those dark hours. By the time she finished recounting her story, her voice was steady and firm, filled with a newfound determination. She wouldn't be silent. She wouldn't allow her experience to be dismissed or buried. Her friend promised to get the story out, to make sure the truth was heard. As Aaliyah hung up, she felt a weight lift from her chest, replaced by a feeling of empowerment and relief. Whatever came next, she was prepared. The day of Aaliyah's discharge arrived sooner than she'd expected, and with it came a sense of both relief and trepidation. She felt lighter as she left the hospital, the fresh air on her face a welcome contrast to the stifling confines she'd endured. But in the back of her mind, she knew her battle was just beginning. Her story was now in the hands of her friend, and she could only wait, hoping it would reach the people who needed to hear it. A few days later, her phone buzzed with a notification. Her friend had kept their word. The story had gone public, hitting every major news outlet in the city. Headlines like racism in healthcare, patient speaks out on harrowing treatment, and neglect in the shadows, hospital scandal exposed, blazed across her screen. Her heart raced as she read through the article, seeing her experience laid out in stark detail. She'd held nothing back, recounting the cold hostility of Nurse Bethany, the dismissive comments she'd overheard, and the way she'd been abandoned in the dark hallway. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media flooded with reactions, the comments ranging from shock to anger, disbelief to calls for accountability. People began sharing their own stories, other patients who had experienced similar treatment, emboldened by Aaliyah's courage to come forward. Within hours, hashtags like Justice for Aaliyah and Stop Medical Racism were trending. The public outcry was undeniable. By the next morning, the hospital was forced to respond. They released a carefully worded statement expressing their deep regret over Aaliyah's experience, promising a thorough investigation into the allegations. But to Aaliyah, the words felt hollow, a token gesture to appease the public rather than a genuine acknowledgement of the hospital's systemic issues. Soon, Bethany and other staff members began speaking out as well, their voices defensive and deflective. In an interview with a local news station, Bethany's face appeared on the screen, her expression tight, her tone controlled but visibly tense. It's disappointing to see my reputation questioned like this, Bethany said, her voice filled with strained sincerity. I care deeply about all my patients. This accusation is based on misunderstandings, and it hurts to be portrayed in such a negative light. Another nurse, who had been working on the same shift, spoke up in Bethany's defense. This job is demanding, and sometimes people just don't understand the pressures we're under. We do our best, and it's unfortunate that certain actions are being misconstrued. Aaliyah watched the interview, feeling a surge of anger rise within her. She could see the deflection, the subtle downplaying of her experience. The nurses were painting themselves as victims, ignoring the harm they'd caused and refusing to acknowledge the underlying prejudice that had shaped her treatment. More defensive responses surfaced online. Comments from some of the hospital staff and their supporters accused her of exaggerating, of seeking attention. But each time she felt her anger build, she would see another message of support, another patient's story, or another call for change from the public, and it reassured her that her voice was not alone. Within days, protesters began gathering outside the hospital, holding signs demanding accountability and justice. Media outlets continued covering the story, digging deeper into the hospital's practices and uncovering similar complaints from former patients. Aaliyah's story had unleashed a wave, a force for change that could no longer be ignored. She sat at home, watching the news, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and relief. She had been heard, and her story was making a difference. Despite the hospital's attempts to deny and deflect, the public had rallied around her, demanding answers, demanding better. Aaliyah knew that the fight wasn't over, that real change would take time, but for now, she allowed herself a small smile, feeling the weight of her silence finally lifted. She had taken a stand, and people were listening. As the days passed, the public outcry only grew louder, with calls for accountability, putting relentless pressure on the hospital administration. Aaliyah's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, shared stories, and even offers from advocates and lawyers offering to help. Each message solidified what she already knew in her heart. This was far from over. One evening, as she scrolled through the latest updates, an email caught her eye. It was from a civil rights attorney named Denise Ford, someone well respected in the community for her work on behalf of marginalized individuals who'd faced discrimination. The email was brief but encouraging, inviting Aaliyah to meet and discuss her experience. Denise believed Aaliyah had grounds to sue and wanted to ensure that her voice and the voices of others like her could not be silenced or swept under the rug. The idea of suing the hospital hadn't been Aaliyah's initial plan, but as she read Denise's words, she felt a surge of purpose. She thought of the pain, the humiliation, and the injustice she had endured, as well as the countless others who might have faced the same treatment, but hadn't had the strength or opportunity to speak up. This was her chance to hold them accountable. A few days later, she met with Denise in her office. Denise listened intently as Aaliyah recounted every detail, her eyes filled with empathy but also a fierce resolve. "We have a strong case," Denise said firmly once Aaliyah had finished. "What you endured wasn't just negligence, it was discrimination. By suing, you'll be forcing the hospital to confront its culture, and you'll be setting an example for every other institution that thinks they can treat patients this way." Aaliyah nodded, her decision solidifying. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else," she replied. "If they won't listen to our voices, maybe they'll listen when it hits their bottom line." Aaliyah's resolve only grew stronger after her lawsuit against the hospital was officially filed. Support poured in from former patients, activists, and community members who were outraged by her story. But there was also a backlash. Some people accused her of exaggerating or being overly sensitive, questioning her motivations and her account of the events. Each harsh comment only made her more determined. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for anyone who had ever suffered neglect and discrimination in silence. Denise Ford, her attorney, was with her every step of the way. She assured Aaliyah that her case was strong, that the pattern of negligence and mistreatment they were uncovering in the hospital's records and testimonies would be undeniable. After months of gathering evidence, Denise was ready. She'd found other patients who had endured similar treatment from Nurse Bethany Hensley and the hospital staff. Their stories painted a grim picture of a hospital where certain patients were dismissed, disregarded, and dehumanized. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed with reporters, supporters, and former patients who wanted to witness what they hoped would be a moment of justice. Aaliyah's hands trembled slightly as she sat beside Denise, but she steadied herself, reminding herself why she was here. Across the aisle, she spotted Bethany, sitting straight-backed, her face tight with composure. She was ready to defend herself, and Aaliyah could see the flash of irritation in her eyes. Denise delivered her opening statement with calm conviction. She described Aaliyah's experience, recounting the negligence and outright hostility that Aaliyah had endured from Nurse Bethany. Denise argued that Aaliyah's case was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a broader issue, a culture within the hospital that allowed certain patients to be treated as burdens rather than individuals deserving of care and respect. The defense lawyer countered, painting Aaliyah as a difficult patient who was dissatisfied with her care and misinterpreted ordinary challenges as hostility. He insisted that Bethany had only been doing her job, and that Aaliyah had taken routine healthcare stresses personally. His tone was dismissive, suggesting that Aaliyah was blowing a minor incident out of proportion. The first witness called to the stand was a former patient who described her own experience with Bethany. She spoke of cold, dismissive treatment, the way Bethany had ignored her pain and discomfort, treating her with impatience rather than empathy. The defense lawyer attempted to discredit her, suggesting she might have misread the nurse's tone. But Denise brought out clear, consistent details in her testimony that mirrored Aaliyah's experience. Then it was Aaliyah's turn to take the stand. Her heart pounded, but she spoke with determination, recounting the events in detail. She described the long night in the dark hallway, the dismissive and hostile comments from Bethany, the threatening words meant to silence her. The courtroom was silent, every word carrying the weight of her pain and her resilience. Bethany's lawyer cross-examined her, questioning if she'd truly understood what she'd overheard, suggesting that her pain and vulnerability might have made her more sensitive than usual. He implied that she was projecting her frustrations onto Bethany, who had only been doing her best under difficult conditions. But Aaliyah held her ground, repeating the cruel, dismissive words that had been spoken to her, the tone that made it impossible to misinterpret the nurse's intentions. The following day, Bethany took the stand. She spoke in a calm, almost contrived voice, portraying herself as a dedicated nurse who was under tremendous pressure, insisting that Aaliyah's accusations were deeply hurtful to her. "I care deeply about all my patients," Bethany said, her voice filled with strained sincerity. "This accusation is based on misunderstandings, and it hurts to be portrayed in such a negative light." Her lawyer guided her carefully, framing her as a hard-working professional who was misunderstood by a difficult patient. Bethany emphasized how overworked she had been, how challenging her job was, and how sometimes patients were simply unable to appreciate the efforts made for them. She portrayed herself as a victim, as someone who was underappreciated and unfairly blamed. When Denise cross-examined her, Bethany's calm facade began to waver. Denise pressed her on specific remarks, asking her directly if she had told Aaliyah, "Respect is earned, Ms. Johnson." Bethany hesitated, her face tightening as she tried to explain it away. "I only meant that sometimes patients expect too much," she answered, her voice slipping into a cold edge. Denise caught that shift and pushed harder, highlighting the pattern of Bethany's behavior from other patients' testimonies. Bit by bit, Bethany's composed exterior began to crack. She grew defensive, attempting to deflect responsibility, but each answer revealed more of her underlying hostility. As the trial continued, more witnesses took the stand, former patients who had suffered similar treatment from Bethany and other nurses. One by one, they recounted stories of dismissive care, belittling comments, and subtle but unmistakable hostility, especially toward minority patients. Denise presented evidence of performance reviews that noted Bethany's lack of sensitivity toward certain patients, showing that this wasn't the first time her behavior had been questioned. The defense lawyer fought back, accusing each witness of holding grudges or overreacting to routine healthcare frustrations. But the more the defense tried to discredit these accounts, the more the pattern of mistreatment came into focus. At last, the final day of the trial arrived. Denise stood to give her closing argument, her voice steady and impassioned as she spoke of Aaliyah's courage. "What happened to Ms. Johnson is a reflection of something much deeper," Denise said, turning to face the jury. "She was treated as less than, her humanity ignored, her needs dismissed, all because of prejudice that has no place in healthcare. This trial is not only about what happened to Ms. Johnson, it's about every patient who has walked into that hospital and been treated as a burden instead of a person. We ask that you deliver justice, not just for Aaliyah, but for all those who have suffered in silence." The defense lawyer gave his own closing statement, insisting once more that the accusations were unfortunate misunderstandings, claiming that Bethany had been unfairly targeted in a case of misinterpretation. He asked the jury to consider the demands of Bethany's role and the pressures she faced. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict in Aaliyah's favor. The court ordered the hospital to pay substantial damages for the emotional distress and neglect she'd endured. More than that, the court required the hospital to conduct a full internal review of its practices, including mandated training on sensitivity and non-discrimination. Bethany's license was placed under review, and disciplinary action followed shortly after. Aaliyah walked out of the courthouse, a mix of relief and empowerment filling her heart. She had not only won justice for herself, but had taken a stand for those who might never have been heard otherwise. In the days and weeks that followed, the hospital came under intense scrutiny. Sweeping reforms were introduced, policies were changed, and training programs were put in place. Aaliyah's courage had forced the hospital to confront its own failings and had set in motion a shift in how they approached patient care. As she looked out at the crowd of supporters waiting outside the courthouse, Aaliyah felt an overwhelming sense of closure. She had taken on a system that had tried to silence her, and she had won. Her voice had sparked change, and she knew it would ripple out to impact countless others. She had been heard, and in that moment, she knew her struggle had made a difference. The weeks after the trial felt surreal to Aaliyah. In her quiet moments, the reality of everything she had endured and everything she had achieved finally began to settle in. She would sit by her window, watching the world outside, feeling an odd blend of exhaustion and satisfaction, as if the weight she had carried for so long had been lifted, leaving her both lighter and deeply changed. She thought back to the night she'd spent in that dim, empty hallway, the whispers and the coldness that had made her feel more vulnerable than she'd ever felt in her life. She remembered the sting of Bethany's dismissive tone, the hollow feeling in her chest as she'd realized she was alone, unseen, and unheard. At the time, she had felt powerless, a helpless patient with no control over her own care or even her own dignity. But now, sitting here, she felt something else entirely: pride. She hadn't let herself be silenced or dismissed, despite how small and broken they had tried to make her feel. She had reclaimed her voice and her power, and in doing so, she had forced a reckoning that would make a difference not just for her, but for countless others. The messages of support continued to flood in. Former patients reached out to share their own stories, their own moments of feeling invisible or disregarded in a system that had failed them. Many thanked her for speaking out, telling her that her courage had inspired them to find their own voices. She had become a symbol of resilience and change, and while the attention sometimes felt overwhelming, Aaliyah took it as a sign that her struggle had not been in vain. There were still moments of doubt, fleeting thoughts of the things people had said to discredit her, of the hurtful accusations that she had been overly sensitive or ungrateful. But Denise's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that no one who mattered had questioned her experience or her worth. She thought about the judge, the jury, the supporters, and even the media, all the people who had listened to her and had seen the truth in her story. And she knew, deep down, that her truth had spoken louder than any attempt to discredit her. The trial itself had been grueling, a mental and emotional marathon. Facing Bethany in court had stirred up emotions she had thought she'd buried, yet each word she spoke on the stand had strengthened her resolve. She could still picture Bethany's face, the mask slipping with each pointed question Denise had asked, revealing glimpses of the same callousness that Aaliyah had endured that night. It had been vindicating to see Bethany finally held accountable, no longer shielded by her role or her excuses. The justice system had seen through the facade, and that was a victory Aaliyah would carry with her forever. Reflecting on it all, she realized that her journey hadn't just been about seeking justice. It had been about finding herself again, reclaiming her dignity and her strength. In the days after her discharge, she had felt fragile, like the world was too big and overwhelming for her to face. But now, with the trial behind her and the public's support still lifting her, she felt whole again, more herself than she'd ever been. Aaliyah knew the hospital's reforms would take time. That change in such an ingrained culture wouldn't happen overnight. But she also knew that her lawsuit had been a catalyst, the first spark in a movement toward accountability and compassion in healthcare. Policies were being reviewed, staff training programs implemented, and new protocols set in place to ensure that no patient, regardless of race or background, would ever feel like she had felt. And while it was only a beginning, it was a beginning she had helped create. As she stood by her window, looking out at the evening sky, Aaliyah felt a profound sense of peace. Her battle had been long and painful, but it had led her here, to this moment of quiet victory. She had faced down an entire institution, armed only with her truth and her resilience, and she had won. The scars from her experience would remain, but they no longer felt like burdens. They were reminders of her strength, markers of a journey that had transformed her pain into power. She knew the fight for justice and equality was far from over, but she was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. She had found her voice, and she knew that voice would continue to make a difference, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt unseen or unheard. As she closed her eyes, she breathed in deeply, feeling the warmth of her own hard-won peace. In that moment, Aliyah knew she had truly taken her life back, and she was ready for whatever came next.